The Northern Crusades were the first organised conflicts against fellow Europeans who were still non-Christian, principally the people living around the Baltic Sea, and would begin in the year 1147. These crusades would span almost 350 years, ending only when the last of these Baltic pagan people had been forcibly converted to Christianity. The people called the Wends, a loose confederation of Slavic people who lived in what is now northeastern Germany and who were immediately adjacent to Christian Europe, not surprisingly, would be the first victims of these religious wars. The Pope at the time, Eugenius III, took a very uncompromising line on the pagan Wends as the crusade was being organised, and he made it clear to the Crusaders that paganism must be crushed and no leeway given, even the offer of payment of tribute. Quote, "On pain of excommunication, we grant that nobody is to accept from the pagans whom it is possible to subjugate to the Christian faith either money or any other form of bribe to allow them to remain in their state of faithlessness." Unquote. In other words, they must either convert to Christianity or be destroyed. The Wends would be attacked by not only two German Saxon armies from the west and two Danish forces from the north, but also by the Christian Poles as well, so a simultaneous and powerful attack from multiple sides. But this First Northern Crusade, alternatively called the Wendish Crusade, didn't quite go according to plan and was considered a failure. So what happened during this conflict, and how were the pagan Wends eventually defeated and forced to convert to Christianity? Let's get into it. By the way, this is the second part of a three-part series on the Wendish Crusade, and if you'd like to know a little more about what was happening a century or two before the Crusade and the increasing pressure on the Wends to convert during this time, you can also check out the first part of this series, although all the videos can be watched on their own as well. They don't need to be watched in sequence to make sense. And there will be a third part covering the capture of the island of Rugia, the last stronghold of paganism in what is present-day Germany. The link to the first video is on the top right of the picture, and there's also a link in the description below. In addition, there is a link to an introductory video to the Northern Crusades in general in the description as well. Also, this video is split into chapters, and if you'd like to skip ahead to any particular section in the video, the chapter links are in the description as well. So in part one, we went through how by the middle of the 12th century, the Wendish people and the other pagan Baltic nations in general found themselves surrounded by Christian nations. Over the previous centuries, there had been growing pressure through multiple invasions by the German Saxons and incursions by Christian missionaries to persuade these people to convert and give up their own beliefs and customs. All to no avail, though, and the Wends, as well as the other pagan nations, had doggedly stuck to their own religions. Only the Pomeranians, the people living in what is now the Baltic area of Poland, ultimately converted after dire threats from the Catholic Polish king of an imminent large-scale invasion and destruction unless they became Christian. But the fall of Pomerania had the effect of leaving the Wends pretty much isolated, surrounded as they were by Catholic countries. The Baltic people faced threats from several directions in the mid-12th century. In military terms, the most immediate threat had always been the German Holy Roman Empire and the Saxons west of the Elbe River. For a time, the Wends had had a stay of execution as the various German emperors were occupied with internal threats and rivals to the throne. In addition, they were occupied in expanding German control into Italy. But this would change because many of the German nobles, dukes and margraves were interested instead in extending their control east of the Elbe River and into Slavic territory to increase their wealth and power. The casus belli would be the obvious one, that these people were pagans rather than Christians and therefore needed to be subjugated and converted. The German Saxons weren't the only Christian power interested in extending control over Slavic lands. The Danes and the Swedes were to the north and in time would organise crusades of their own against the Baltic people. And then there were the Poles to the east, who were Slavs themselves but had been converted around 200 years earlier and were now fervent Christians looking to convert the pagan people adjacent to them. And finally, the Russians also had eyes on Baltic territory as well. They had also accepted Christianity around 150 years earlier, Greek Orthodox Christianity that is, and sought to convert the Baltic people as well. In fact, the Catholic German Crusaders in what would be called Livonia, which is present-day Estonia and Latvia, would in time clash with Russian armies in their fight for these lands and the right to convert the people there to their form of Christianity. Arguably the greatest threat, though, was the papacy in Rome and the Catholic Church in general, which had the ambition to extend its dominion over what was left of non-Christian Europe and had been sending missionaries into these areas, as well as urging the adjacent Christian powers to subjugate and convert the pagans. All it needed was some sort of excuse or trigger for conflict to materialise, which the Church could use to set the ball rolling for violence on a much grander scale and harness the manpower of Christian Europe into an organised attack or crusade on the Baltic people. Pope Eugenius III, who had been made pontiff relatively recently in 1145, no doubt wanted to make his mark and was a strong advocate of aggressive action against both the Muslims and, as it would turn out, to the pagans to the north as well. That excuse for religious war against the pagans came when news arrived about fresh conflict in the Middle East with the Muslims and a substantial setback for the Crusaders, who had founded several kingdoms there in the wake of the First Crusade. On the 24th of December 1144, the Crusader state of Edessa in Syria fell after almost a month-long siege by Zengi, the Turkoman emir of Mosul. Edessa was one of 4 Christian Crusader states established after the successes of the First Crusade around 50 years earlier. So this was a major blow for the Christian crusading community in the Middle East. There was a danger that the remaining 3 Crusader states could also fall into Muslim hands, for Zengi was an exceptional military commander. These were the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Various bishops from Armenia adjacent to the now fallen Edessa, as well as various embassies from Christian-controlled Antioch as well as Jerusalem, quickly made their way to Europe, begging for assistance from the Pope and warning that the Muslims could advance still further if help didn't arrive from the Christian West in good time. Even Jerusalem may be lost. And as expected, this news caused quite a general alarm all across Europe as the news spread of the fall of Edessa. These messengers found Pope Eugenius quite receptive to their pleas for help, and over the coming months, Eugenius would begin planning a considered response on how to get the masses of Christian Europe geared up for war. On the 1st of December 1145, the Pope would issue his famous papal bull, later known as Quantum Predecessores, urging a new crusade against the Muslims. Although the Franks and other Christian communities had been fighting pagans and Muslims for many centuries, this was the first time a pope had ever issued a formal papal bull encouraging holy war against unbelievers. In the bull, which was largely directed at the French King Louis VII, as well as the French nobility and people, the Pope would remind them of the achievements of the Frankish people in the First Crusade and how the Crusaders, quote, did free from the filth of the pagans that city where our Saviour willed to suffer for us, unquote. And he exhorted the French nobility and people to forget the fine things of life and to, quote, show zeal and diligence with all their strength in the matter of arms, horses and other things with which they may fight the infidels, unquote. In his message, he stressed the importance of the mission, which was to, quote, oppose the multitude of infidels in order to save the Church of God, unquote. Perhaps the most important section of the papal bull, and which made the idea of a crusade considerably more attractive for the common illiterate masses, was the remission of all sins and full absolution for those who took the cross, similar to the promises given by Pope Urban II during the First Crusade. In other words, going to the crusade meant a straight ticket to the Christian heaven, no questions asked if the crusader died during the conflict. And this promise of sins being wiped out by the very act of fighting Muslims would have a great impact on the common masses. The papal bull itself would be copied and circulated by numerous other preachers and clergy all around France, making it the most widely circulated document of the medieval age. It's known the document went as far afield as Brittany to the west and on to England, Flanders, Denmark and Germany to the north, and Bohemia to the east. So it's apparent the message of the Pope was circulated as far and wide as possible in the Catholic world at least. The Pope's message would get a good response from 2 of the most important monarchs at the time in Europe. These were the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, essentially the German king. The King of France happened to be Louis VII, and he was a pretty young chap at the time and very eager for the crusade, although his courtiers realised the crusade would involve quite a large financial expenditure and an exhausting foreign expedition. The German emperor at this time was Conrad III, and he too would turn out to be pretty enthusiastic about the venture. He had recently come to the throne and perhaps wanted to prove himself in a foreign expedition as well. So, a really good start for the Second Crusade, but it was essential to also get the support of the French and German nobility and aristocracy as well, who could provide the manpower and money. And of course, the most important component of a crusade was the support of the common Christian masses up and down the numerous villages and towns across Europe. The peasants and working classes who would form the bulk of the fighting force in any crusade and who were therefore expected to volunteer en masse for the task. What was needed was somebody on the ground to tour the villages, towns, and cities of France and Germany to whip up the enthusiasm of the masses, as well as to organise matters with the nobility and aristocracies of France and Germany. Essentially, someone to preach and manage and create the momentum for the crusade. The man that Pope Eugenius would choose to manage the crusade would be a Cistercian monk, the Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, or Saint Bernard as he was later known. The Pope chose the right person. Bernard was one of the most aggressive and fanatical of all the Christian clergy in Europe, but also, as it turned out, one of the most energetic of the time. He was pretty forthright in his opinion as well, even labelling a rival of Eugenius as Pope as a Jew sitting on the throne of St. Peter. Bernard, as the Pope knew, was generally enthusiastic regarding war, and in fact he is now generally considered to be almost the sole inspiration for the Second Crusade and the Wendish Crusade, travelling as he would for nearly 9 months across France and Germany, and drumming up a huge amount of support for holy war and filling the hearts and minds of the common masses with religious fervour for the operation. On the 1st of March 1146, the Pope reissued his papal bull Quantum Predecessoris, following which he formally gave responsibility and leadership of driving the crusade forward to Bernard. Otto of Freising wrote that the Pope wanted the abbot to, quote, preach and move the hearts of all the people of France and Germany, unquote, and to thereby causing an avalanche of volunteers for the new conflict. To get the ball rolling, the Pope convened an assembly at a place called Vézelay in central France on the 31st of March 1146 during the Easter period. In other words, only a few weeks after the papal bull had been reissued. This was to be a meeting of the high and mighty of France, and to which all the aristocrats and nobles of France were invited, including, of course, the French king Louis VII. But huge crowds of common people were also expected to turn up at the event and volunteer for the crusade, and the town itself didn't have sufficient space in its public square for such masses of people. So an outside makeshift platform was erected on the southeast slopes of the hill of Vézelay, where the masses could gather to hear what had been decided at the assembly and to take part in the service and, of course, volunteer for the crusade. At the assembly itself, the French king spoke passionately about the need for war against the Muslims. Quote, let us not suffer this valour to grow haughty, but by brave assistance let it raise up the friends of God and ourselves overseas, that is, the Christians. Let it strike down in heavy persecution its enemies who are base and not even worthy to be called men, unquote. And he added, quote, know that a great devotion to this war is come upon me. Wherefore I pray earnestly that you will endeavour to give strength to my resolution by your company and assistance, unquote. St. Bernard, who was directing affairs, then took centre stage at this meeting and asked the nobles assembled to ready themselves for the crusade, and many heeded the request immediately and received the pilgrim's cross, including the king himself. The main service was then held outside on the constructed stage on the hill. Bernard would address the crowd from the platform and, by all accounts, gave a powerful speech on the matter. In this address and the various later letters and speeches that he delivered all around Europe, he declared the holy places in Europe had been, quote, cleansed of pagan filth by the sword of our fathers, unquote, and that it was up to the present generation to maintain the Christian grip on these places. Bernard warned of the Muslims being implements of the devil himself, and that there was a real threat of them capturing still further territory. Quote, alas, if there should be none to withstand him, he will soon invade the very city of the living God, overturn the arsenal of our redemption, and defile the holy places which have been adorned by the blood of the immaculate Lamb, unquote. And that if action wasn't taken, more trouble would be stored up. Quote, for our sins, the enemy of the cross has begun to lift his sacrilegious head there, to devastate with the sword that blessed land, that land of promise, unquote. Now, this powerful and incendiary speech meant that as the meeting at Vézelay wound up, numerous commoners and peasants also stepped forward to join the crusade, and all were given crosses of cloth to sew on their clothes. The nobles, meanwhile, who had volunteered for the crusade would travel back to their lands to begin preparation for war. So Bernard had managed to engineer a very successful start to the proceedings. By the way, anyone visiting Vézelay today can still see a chapel built on the hillside to commemorate the sermon by St Bernard kicking off the crusade. After the assembly at Vézelay, Bernard would begin his travels touring energetically and extensively across France, drumming up further support. And this touring would carry on all through the spring, summer and winter of 1146 before he crossed into Germany to continue his preaching for the crusade there as well. As momentum began to quickly build up for the crusade, the Pope issued another bull called Divine Dispensation on the 5th of October 1146. In this bull, the Pope declared that King Louis of France, along with numerous aristocrats, had already volunteered for the crusade to, quote, conquer the enemies of the cross of Christ, unquote, and he urged all others to follow their example in, quote, such a holy labour, unquote. In the papal bull, he again confirmed the remission of all sins for those taking part. So this new papal bull helped to push the momentum for the crusade to even higher levels. Now, one of the immediate and dramatic effects of the call to crusade was the outbreak of pogroms and massacres of Jews across various cities and towns in France and Germany in particular. This had happened 50 years earlier in 1096 when the First Crusade had been called. At that time, many thousands of Jews had been slaughtered or forced to convert by locals and crusaders passing through the towns and cities as they travelled to the Holy Land. The reason for this was that Jews were also non-Christian like the Muslims and therefore seen as natural targets as well. So with the call for another crusade, the same reaction against the Jews could be seen happening again. Gibbet of Nogent described the Crusaders attacking the, quote, internal enemies of Christendom, meaning the Jews, before going on to confront the, quote, external enemies of Christ, meaning Islam. A Jewish writer of the time wrote the sentiments many would-be Crusaders had at that time for Jews. Quote, behold, we travel to a distant land to do battle with the kings of that land. We take our lives in our hands to kill or subjugate all the kingdoms which do not believe in the crucified. How much more should we subjugate or kill the Jews who killed and crucified him? And it would not be surprising if that was the kind of attitude perhaps most people held at that time up and down the towns and villages of Europe. The worst of the atrocities were instigated by a Christian Cistercian monk called Rudolf or Radolf. Rudolf was a Frenchman who had unilaterally decided to leave his monastery on hearing of St Bernard preaching a new crusade. He would trek through German territory inciting violence against Jews everywhere he went. Rudolf hated the Jews for being the enemies of Christendom, and he therefore believed that they should be slain wherever they were found. The most dangerous aspect of Rudolf was that he was just as charismatic in terms of preaching as St Bernard, and therefore gained a large following as he recruited not only for the crusade but violence against the Jews. Otto of Freising criticised him as a rustic, only moderately imbued with the knowledge of letters, although he was praised by many others for his fiery speeches against the Jews. A man, quote, of wonderful sanctity, unquote, was how the Annales Rodensis composed just north of Aachen described him, for example, and which went on to describe Rudolf's, quote, great and famous preaching, unquote, being so powerful that it seemed as if 1/10 of the entire land had volunteered for the crusade. Rudolf's main argument, apart from Jews not being believers and therefore being to all intents and purposes enemies of Christendom, was that they were not contributing any money towards the crusade. So for this reason alone, it was legitimate to attack the enemy within. He preyed on the latent feelings of hostility and anti-Semitism in society and amongst those who had volunteered for the crusade. We know Rudolf travelled from a monastery in France into the Low Countries before passing through the Rhine area of Cologne, Mainz, Worms, Speyer, Strasbourg and numerous other towns along the way. The same towns and cities where anti-Jewish pogroms had taken place during the First Crusade and along which Rudolf began inspiring new pogroms and riots. Ephraim of Bonn, a Jewish chronicler of the time who wrote of the violence in the 1170s in his Book of Remembrance, described Rudolf egging on the people to murder Jews. Rudolf, he wrote, was, quote, the priest of idolatry who rose against the nation of God to destroy, slay and annihilate them. Rudolf sought to contaminate the Christians with the horizontal vertical sign, meaning the cross. He went along barking and was named Barker, summoning all in the name of Christ to go to Jerusalem to war against Ishmael, meaning the Muslims. Whenever he went, he spoke evil of the Jews of the land and incited the snake and the dogs against us, saying, "Avenge the crucified one upon his enemies who stand before you, then go to war against the Ishmaelites." Unquote. The famous rallying call for the mobs hunting down Jews at that time was the word Hep. Hep was short for Hierusalima est perdita, meaning Jerusalem is lost, and this was presumably to whip up anger and passion. And if any Jew was within earshot of this cry by the mob, it really was the time to flee or hide or face death or torture. Mobs shouting Hep could be commonly heard in cities like Cologne, Metz, Worms, Speyer and Strasbourg. In these riots, not just the common folk, but members of the Christian clergy took an active part, and some of the instances of violence were pretty gruesome. And the violence was not restricted to targeting men either. A Jewish woman, for example, had her ears and tongue cut off for not agreeing to be baptized. And at Speyer, a Jewish woman was tortured on the rack to force her to convert to Christianity. The Jews didn't particularly get much sympathy or practical help from the church authorities in general or from the Pope himself during these times. Some Christian clerics did try to protect the Jews. Henry, the Archbishop of Mainz, for instance, allowed some Jews to hide in his house, but the mob broke into the property and killed the Jews in front of him. Earlier, during the First Crusade, many Jews had survived through the liberal use of protection money to local lords and Christian clergy, who then hid them in churches and castles till the mob violence died down. And the same happened during the Second Crusade as well, with many Jews offering money in return for life. In Cologne, for example, the Archbishop took money and their property as collateral in return for safety and refuge in the fortress of Valkenburg, southeast of the city. An elderly Jew, presumably without money, had his head cut off for not agreeing to convert, and the head was placed on the roof of a house as an example to other Jews. In this way, a huge amount of money was extorted from richer Jews who could afford to pay out, while others less fortunate were slaughtered. But there was no clear call for the violence to end from the church in general. Peter the Venerable, the Abbot of Cluny, another well-known character of the time, wrote justifying the extortion of money and, like Rudolf, chose pretty inflammatory language. He criticised the Jews for their lack of understanding of Christianity and blamed them for the murder of Christ, describing them as, quote, vile blasphemers and far worse than the Saracens, unquote, although his attitude had a shade more mercy than Rudolf's. Quote, "I must emphasise that I'm not asking that they should be killed, but to encourage strongly that they should be punished for their evil in accordance with his set limits," meaning God. Instead, Peter the Venerable argued, like Rudolf, that the Jews should be made to pay for the cost of the crusade, even though they had nothing to gain and it was not their struggle. Quote, "Let their lives be saved, but their money be taken away in order that their money can help the Christians fight the Saracens," unquote. And he would accuse them of actively working against Christianity and that they were secretly storing up grain, wine, money, gold and silver by false means, and that they stole holy vessels and relics from churches to undermine the Christian faith. Quote, "It would be foolish, if not actually insulting to divinity, I think, if this holy expedition should be properly financed by Christian property unless the monies of the profane," meaning the Jews, "were not used to a greater degree," unquote, he wrote, justifying the extraction of protection money from the Jews. But these comments, relatively benign compared to the ones from Rudolf, came too late, and the attacks on Jews in Germany inspired copycat riots and the killing of Jews in various cities in France as well. And perhaps King Louis of France was also influenced by aggressive talk like this from the clergy. Ephraim of Bonn writes that the king would declare that anyone volunteering for crusading would be exempt from any debts to the Jews, and that they would be exempt also from paying any interest on any loans as well taken from Jews. These laws would, as expected, impoverish many Jews who lost an immense part of their wealth given out as loans to Christians in previous years. So what did St. Bernard, the main instigator of the Second Crusade, think about these pogroms? Well, he was against violence like Peter the Venerable, although not entirely in favour of complete tolerance either. It was only in November of that year that Bernard, and to his credit, finally had a meeting with Rudolf at the city of Mainz, where he persuaded him and his henchmen to stop encouraging anti-Jewish violence. This was not because he had any special dislike for violence, but for another reason, and that was that he felt killing Jews was against God's great plan. The Jews needed to be left alive to, quote, "remind us of what our Lord suffered. They are dispersed all over the world so that by expiating their crimes they may be everywhere the living witnesses of our redemption," unquote. As far as he was concerned, it was best to convert them because killing them meant their souls could never reach the Christian heaven. Quote, "If the Jews are utterly wiped out, what will become of our hope for their promised salvation, their eventual conversion?" Bernard asked. Added to that, they were a subjugated race and did not pose any danger to Christendom. Quote, "Is it not a far better triumph for the Church to convince and convert the Jews than to put them all to the sword?" he asked. In contrast, the Muslims were actively attacking Christendom and therefore it was right to attack them. In other words, a holy war was justified. He did, though, criticise money lending, an activity that was associated with Jews, and warned people to abstain from this business, which made them, quote, "worse than any Jew," unquote. And so the anti-Semitic violence gradually wound down with the orders of Bernard, but it was only in the middle of 1147 when most, if not all, the Crusaders had left for the Middle East that the bulk of the Jews could return safely to their homes. Ephraim of Bonn would perhaps a little triumphantly write that this was not the case with the Crusaders and that only a small number of the murderers, as he called them, ever returned to their homeland, as he wrote of the failure of the crusade. So getting back to Bernard's progress in preaching the crusade, he had only really been active in France so far during 1146. But in October of that year, Bernard, like Rudolf before him, crossed into Germany and travelled through the various cities, haranguing the people there to also join the crusade. Bernard would move to Frankfurt, reaching there in mid-November, where he would meet the German emperor. And in December, he would move through numerous towns and cities in Germany. And he would essentially use the same tactics as Rudolf and other preachers, appealing to the masses to wage war against the unbeliever. Quote, "For our sins, the enemy of the cross has begun to lift his sacrilegious head there, to devastate with the sword that blessed land, that land of promise," he wrote. Bernard reminded his listeners that Jerusalem and the other territories had been won by great sacrifice, but if the present audience did not react and win back the places lost to Islam, quote, "it would be a source of confusion and endless shame for our generation," unquote. As is to be expected from medieval sources, plenty of sundry miracles were recorded as happening in all the various places Bernard visited. Many blind or lame people were allegedly miraculously cured as he travelled through the towns and cities, and these were recorded in a book called A History of the Miracles Performed on the German Journey. This was a biographical anthology of Bernard's travels from November 1146 to February 1147 as he traipsed his way across Germany preaching the crusade. Accounts relate how no less than 235 cripples were healed and 172 blind people recovered their sight, while deaf and dumb people were also cured and demons cast out of those possessed. Some of the miracles were rather comical and what we would consider a little quaint. The Chronicon of Fligamense, another 12th century source, for example, describes how Bernard approached a statue of the Virgin Mary in a church and said, "Ave Maria," and the statue came to life and promptly responded with an Ave Bernard. Now, these miracles were fairly stereotypical Christian miracles, and anyone reading the Bible might realise that this was much more than Jesus himself had allegedly done. There was even an account of a person being raised from the dead to spice up the narrative still further. But we'll leave aside the obvious issue this raises, that St. Bernard could outdo Jesus himself on the miracles front. What these stories no doubt generated was confidence in the masses that the crusade met the approval of God himself. Otherwise, how could these miracles occur? Strangely enough, though, no one seems to have questioned why his miraculous powers couldn't be used to recover the city of Edessa itself from the Muslims. These miracles, though, raised another philosophical issue that perhaps crossed Bernard's mind, or was perhaps one of the questions he was asked by the common man at this time. And this was why Jesus or God wasn't putting any effort himself to prevent his city from falling into the hands of the Muslims, or even punishing them. If Jesus could give Bernard the power to do miracles entirely unassociated with the crusade, why not help with the crusade itself? Why was there a need for so many people to migrate to the Middle East and fight the Muslims to achieve the same purpose? Christianity in its history is chock-a-block with miracles of some sort or another. People being healed or other reasonably trivial miracles, but on the things that really mattered on the world stage, the Christian God was remarkably silent and seemingly incapable of repelling the Muslims from taking Christian territory or even Jerusalem. In fact, the Christian God would go further and decide to make the Second Crusade a complete failure. Why was this when it was being done for his cause? Well, Bernard's answer to this conundrum was that God could easily destroy Islam and the Muslim enemy if he wished, but that he was refraining out of kindness and pity to mankind. For he was giving a perfect way of achieving salvation for the common man. Most people did not have the chance to leave their common lives and do something for the good of Christianity, but the Crusade gave them a chance to rectify that and ensure their place in heaven. In other words, God was offering sinners a convenient path to salvation by fighting the infidel. God had planned for Edessa to fall, in other words. Quote, "I tell you that God is trying you," he wrote. "Look, sinners, at the depth of his pity and take courage. He does not want your death, but rather that you should turn to him and live. So he seeks not to overthrow you, but to help you," unquote. However, there was an obvious flaw in this argument, which he could no doubt see as well. What about the people who were too poor, too young, or too old, or frail, or perhaps invalid in some way, who did not have the strength or the wherewithal financially to trek to the far-off Middle East? What about women? Were they to be denied the chance of salvation by God because they could not fight in the crusade themselves? Well, Bernard's defense was that everyone could help the crusade in their way, and that would be sufficient to attain a place in heaven. In other words, warring with Muslims wasn't the only way to take advantage of the crusade and ensure one's salvation. Quote, "It may be known that those of all ages, both old and young, are joined in good order in the forces of this work. Those who are young and strong in body can go to fight in the service of the army of the living God. Those who are weak in body can, through things of the mind, help those who are making the journey. Those who are poor and struggle against weakness of the body can support the army of God through their prayers, words, and comfort." Unquote. So salvation was still open to all, even if one could not join the crusade, and this explanation presumably calmed the fears of all those who could not travel to the Middle East for whatever reason. By the way, it can take quite some time to plan and create these videos, so if you do like these kind of videos and you'd like to help the channel, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you'd like to go a step further, the channel does have a Patreon account as well as other ways for one-off donations. Any help is greatly appreciated. And at this point, I'd like to thank my Patreons who are with me on this journey of creating videos about pagan Europe and its struggles. I really appreciate your backing and support, and sincere thanks for your interest. So what did this call for a crusade to retrieve the city of Edessa from Islam have to do with the pagan Wendish people across the Elbe River, you might be asking? Well, not much at this point, but things changed considerably on the 13th of March 1147. On that day, a large meeting was held in Frankfurt Reichstag, organised by Conrad III, the German emperor, to which all the Saxon nobility and aristocracy were invited. This meeting would be considered the counterpart of the French meeting at Vézelay the previous year, and was ostensibly to drum up support for the crusade in Germany and get the nobles and aristocrats and other assorted high and mighty to volunteer. And Bernard spoke at this assembly as well. However, the result of the assembly was quite different to the one at Vézelay. At the assembly, the German emperor and his nephew and future emperor Frederick Barbarossa publicly committed themselves to the cause, along with some of the nobles as well. However, a substantial number of the nobility, despite Bernard's eloquence and encouragement, showed disinterest and voiced reservations about the logistics involved in trekking to the Holy Land. The distance, they argued, was too much and the journey too arduous. Could they not, they asked Bernard, launch a crusade against their immediate neighbours, the Wends, instead? Surely this was also advancing the cause of Christianity as well, since these people were pagans. Otto of Freising, the 12th century bishop, records it in a more colourful way, saying there was little desire to go to the Middle East, quote, because they had as neighbours certain tribes that were given over to the filthiness of idolatry, unquote. Since the Slavs were non-Christian, they were a legitimate target, just as legitimate a target as the Jews and Muslims were. In addition, many felt since the Wends had been nominally converted in previous years but had reverted to their pagan beliefs, they could be considered apostates. And this was a far worse status than never being a Christian in the first place. Heading this group and arguing enthusiastically for a crusade against the Wends was another cleric, the aggressive and fairly vitriolic Bishop of Havelberg, a chap called Anselm. Anselm was a widely travelled man, having been the Catholic Church ambassador to Constantinople for some time before returning to Germany. Importantly, he was a fierce anti-pagan and had a strong interest in destroying Wendish paganism, being one of those who saw the Wends technically as apostates and therefore deserving of strong punishment. Bernard, not surprisingly, gave the idea his full support. His view was that if he could not convince the Saxon nobles to go to the Middle East, then certainly they could be employed elsewhere against the pagans instead. A letter written by Bernard later described how he, by his authority as the preacher of the crusade, promised them remission of all sins in return for fighting the pagan tribes across the River Elbe. Quote, the might of the Christians was armed against them, and for the complete wiping out, or at any rate the conversion of these peoples, they have put on the cross the sign of our salvation, and we, by virtue of our authority, promise them the same spiritual privileges as those enjoy who set out for Jerusalem, unquote. His other letters exhorting and encouraging the nobles of Germany to fight the pagan Wends could be considered some of the most notorious in Christian history. Famously, he asked the Saxon nobility to unite until, quote, with the help of God, either their religion or their nation be exterminated. And he promised the German Saxons that in all respects the crusade would have the same status as the one against the Muslims, right down to the clothes and uniform of this army and the privileges that volunteers would gain. Of course, it's fair to say, coming from France, he knew nothing about the Wends, their way of life and beliefs, and the fact that they had already accepted Saxon supremacy was also neither here nor there. The main issue was to wipe out all traces of pagan belief and to convert them by force as necessary. And so with this meeting, the Second Crusade now developed into two very distinct theatres of war and two objectives. The first was an advance against Islam in the Middle East, and the second was the destruction of the Wends. In fact, in time there would be a third theatre of war as well, and that was the use of a force of Crusaders travelling to the Middle East for the capture of Lisbon from the Iberian Muslims, but that's a subject for another video. Following this meeting, and after taking this momentous decision for a crusade against the Slavs, Bishop Anselm, one of the most enthusiastic for war, would head a delegation that would travel to see the Pope, who was at that time in Dijon in France, to garner his support for a simultaneous crusade against the Wends. The delegation included other important clerics, including Bishop Bucco of Worms, Wiebold of Stavelot, and Odo of Frankfurt. The delegation met the Pope on the 30th of March, and as expected, he was delighted at the idea and gave his approval for a Wendish Crusade immediately. And a week after this, Bernard himself would head off to see the Pope at Clairvaux to reinforce the point before continuing his preaching across France. Within 5 days of the meeting with Bernard on the 11th of April, the Pope reissued his papal bull from the previous year called Divine Dispensation, which fully endorsed the crusade against the Wends. That, as you might recall, was written with a crusade against the Muslims in mind. He now made it clear that a Wendish crusade was also not only legitimate but held the same status as the main crusade. The bull confirmed a promise made by Bernard that the same indulgences would be offered to those who made the crusade against the Wends as those who went to fight in the Middle East. Eugenius expressed his delight at the enthusiasm and willingness shown by the Saxons for fighting the Wends, and how so many, quote, wishing to share in this sacred work and in the ensuing reward, intend with God's help to go against the Slavs and the other pagans living in the north and subject them to the Christian religion, unquote. And this, combined with the actions of Crusaders in the Middle East, as well as fighting Muslims in Spain, meant God's work was being done. Quote, certain of you, however, are desirous of participating in so holy a work and reward, and plan to go against the Slavs and other pagans living towards the north, and to subject them with the Lord's assistance to the Christian religion. We give heed to the devotion of these men and to all those who have not accepted the cross for going to Jerusalem, and who have decided to go against the Slavs and to remain in the spirit of devotion on that expedition as it is prescribed. We grant that same remission of sin and the same temporal privileges as to the Crusaders to Jerusalem. We believe that it has come about through the providence of divine counsel that so great a multitude of the faithful from diverse regions is preparing to fight the infidel, and that almost the whole of Christendom is being summoned for so praiseworthy a task, unquote. And he would actually take a harder stance than Anselm, perhaps, declaring that anyone showing conciliatory behaviour or taking tribute from the pagans and allowing them to remain pagan would be promptly excommunicated. The Pope also declared that Bishop Anselm would be his legate or representative and spiritual leader for the Wendish Crusade. Quote, immediately he enjoined to us, in remission of our sins, to war to the end the enemies of the Christian name, and to fight the pagans across the River Elbe, was how Wiebold of Stavelot, the 12th century abbot, would record the news. Anselm, meanwhile, would travel to Nuremberg, where the German emperor was holding court at the same time, reaching the city in late April to mid-May, where he would discuss plans with the emperor on this new Wendish Crusade. Now that the Pope had given the crusade his full blessing, Bernard also began spreading the uncompromising message of the Pope that there could be no mercy. He would write an open letter to all the Saxon princes, bishops and archbishops of the Germans, urging them in no uncertain terms to wage war on the heathens across the river. He saw the battle against the pagans in essence as a battle against the devil, for the devil was obviously holding the Wends in his grip. Quote, "But the evil one sees this and resents it. He gnashes his teeth and withers away in fury, for he is losing many of those whom he held bound by various crimes and enormities. Abandoned men are now being converted, turned aside from evil, and making ready to do good. But the evil one feared far more the damage he would incur from the conversion of the pagans, when he heard that their tale was to be completed and that the whole of Israel was to find salvation." Unquote. Having the Wends sticking rigidly to paganism, he declared, was the scheme of the devil himself. Satan feared the Crusaders recovering the Holy Land for Jesus, and to prevent the success of the crusade, he would necessarily incite the pagans to distract the Christians from recovering the lost territory in the Middle East. Quote, "This is what he believes to be threatening him now at this very time, and with all his evil cunning he is endeavouring to see how he can best oppose such a great good. He has raised up evil seed, wicked pagan sons, whom, if I may say so, the might of Christendom has endured too long, shutting its eyes to those who, with evil intent, lie in wait, without crushing their poisoned heads under its heel. But the scriptures say presumption comes first and ruin close behind it. And so God grant that the pride of these peoples may be speedily humbled and the road to Jerusalem not closed on their account." Unquote. And he promised the Saxons that if they attacked the Wends, they would receive the same immunity and remission of sins that Crusaders going to the Middle East would get. Quote, "Because the Lord has committed to our insignificance the preaching of this crusade, we make known to you that at the council of the king, bishops and princes who had come together at Frankfurt, the might of Christians was armed against them, and that for the complete wiping out, or at any rate the conversion of these peoples, they have put on the cross the sign of our salvation, and we, by virtue of our authority, promise them the same spiritual privileges as those enjoy who set out towards Jerusalem. Many took the cross on the spot, and the rest we encourage to do so that all Christians who have not yet taken the cross for Jerusalem may know that they will obtain the same spiritual privileges by undertaking this expedition, if they do so according to the advice of the bishops and princes." Unquote. And as far as showing mercy and any display of tolerance, this, as the Pope commanded, was forbidden, and heathen worship was to be rooted out entirely. Quote, "We utterly forbid that for any reason whatsoever a truce should be made with these peoples, either for the sake of money or for the sake of tribute, until such a time as by God's help either their religion or their nation shall be destroyed. We speak to you, archbishops and bishops, and urge you to oppose any such plan for a truce with all your strength, and to watch with the greatest care this matter, and to apply all the zeal of which you are capable to, seeing that it is carried through manfully. You are the ministers of Christ, and therefore it is demanded of you with all the more confidence that you should watch faithfully over God's work, which, because it is his work, should be especially your concern." Unquote. Bernard declared in case Crusaders just had the intention of looting and plundering and neglected the forced conversion of the people. In terms of the crusade, the uniform, Bernard declared, would be the same as for trekking to the Middle East, as it had the same importance and stature. He asked all the Crusaders to gather together at Magdeburg on the feast of the Apostles Peter and Paul, which fell on the 29th of June. He ended with a heartfelt plea to all and sundry to distribute the message, and that, quote, "a copy of this letter should be carried everywhere, and that the bishops and priests should proclaim it to the people of God and arm them with the Holy Cross against the enemies of the cross of Christ." Unquote. Now, this letter by Bernard and Anselm's meeting with the German Emperor essentially began the momentum which would lead to the Wendish Crusade. Bernard's strong words calling for the Wends to be either converted or destroyed were widely disseminated and garnered strong interest not only among German Saxons but also Poles and Czechs who were adjacent to the pagans and therefore had a territorial interest in defeating the Wends. The Poles also began preparing, as well as the Danes. Interest was also strong in Bohemia, and even as far afield as France and England, volunteers began springing forward, declaring they would rather fight the pagans. So when the time came, the Wendish Crusade would see quite a multinational force march against the Wends, although the bulk of the Crusaders would be German Saxons and Danes. In Poland, Cardinal Humboldt, on hearing of the resolutions at Frankfurt, would also begin preaching the crusade. Meanwhile, the Bishop of Krakow even asked Bernard to extend the crusade against the Russians, who were Greek Orthodox, not Catholic, and therefore heretics as far as he was concerned. He was interested in what was called the whole moral regeneration of Slavia, or Sclavinia as they called Eastern Europe in those days. Since many of the Slavic nations of Eastern Europe had been converted to the Greek Orthodox faith, they needed to be turned to Catholicism, and a crusade would encourage them on the right path. In Bohemia, meanwhile, Zdeněk, the Bishop of Olomouc, had been trying to convert the Baltic Prussians in a missionary tour in 1141, but had largely failed, also called for more robust methods to force these stubborn people into Christianity. And pressure also built up on the Pomeranian people, who had not yet given up on pagan beliefs. Vincent of Prague, a chronicler of the time, records that, quote, many of the bishops of Saxony with many of the Saxon knights went to Pomerania to convert the Pomeranians to the Christian faith, unquote. So, as you can see, this call for a crusade against the Wends could quite easily have snowballed into a far wider conflict against the Greek Orthodox nations of Eastern Europe as well, had the church authorities not decided to concentrate only on the Wends and the Muslim threat in the Middle East. So, before we go into the crusade itself, let's have a quick look at the important characters of the time and who would join and lead the crusade. Let's start with the German characters first. The Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III, as mentioned, had already committed to go crusading to the Middle East alongside the French King Louis VII, and therefore would not take part in the Wendish Crusade. So the attack on the Wends would be led instead by several of the Saxon counts and margraves who controlled territories bordering Wendish land and importantly had much to gain from extending their control further east. The most powerful and influential of this bunch was Henry the Lion, who was the current Duke of Saxony. Helmholtz suggests Henry was more interested in gaining power and wealth from warring with the Wends than spreading Christianity, writing that in all his various expeditions against the Wends, quote, no mention was made of Christianity, but only of money, unquote. His territory was situated on the left bank of the Elbe opposite the Wends, so he was their immediate neighbour and stood to gain the most. Secondly, there was Albrecht, or Albert the Bear, the colourfully titled Saxon margrave. Lothar, a previous German emperor, had installed Albert the Bear as governor of the March of Lusatia. By the 1130s, though, Albert had already begun to expand eastwards into Havelland, while at the same time encouraging Christian Saxon settlers to move into these areas. In the 1140s, he became the Margrave of Brandenburg, even though the city was Slav and not under his direct control, indicating the ambition of the man. A piece of trivia regarding Albert the Bear was that he was much admired by Hitler and was used as a patron of the NSDAP, in other words, the Nazi Party. Thirdly, there was the Saxon Count Henry of Badavid, who originally came from an aristocratic family from Bode near Ebsdorf, also close to the frontier with the Slavs. And the fourth main leader of the Saxon contingent was Conrad, the Margrave of Meissen and later of Lusatia. Conrad was also a big supporter of encouraging Saxons and other Christian people to move into Slavic territories. Now, all these men, as mentioned, had ambitions to annex Slavic territory. In fact, they largely competed with each other for Wendish land and were in turn supported by the archbishops of Magdeburg and Bremen, as the areas they took control of could be Christianized much more easily. Then there were the Danish interested parties, who were also interested in annexing Slavic lands. Like the Saxons, many Danes had no interest in trekking to the Middle East as well. At the time, there was a tussle for the Danish throne between three candidates. Two of these candidates, Canute V and Sweyn III, the story goes, were deeply moved by the Pope's papal bull Divine Dispensation and decided to put aside their differences to take part in the crusade. And no doubt they also felt participating in a crusade would increase their standing and influence at home as well. Quote, rather than neglect the duties of public religion in the pursuit of private warfare, the Danes therefore assume the emblems of holy pilgrimage and obey the command. The two men exchanged hostages and, quote, turned their weapons to the vindication of the faith, unquote, wrote Saxo Grammaticus. In the Knitling saga, written in the 13th century, the narrator explains the two men were given promises by the Pope of plenary indulgences and martyrdom if they did not come back alive. And this seems to have been enough for both the Danish men, and both would join the crusade with their fleets and armies, significantly adding to the strength of the Crusader force. Further to the east was the Polish king Boleslav IV, who also had designs on Wendish and Pomeranian territory, and the crusade provided the perfect excuse for him to try and increase his domain and influence as well. The Polish king would send a force under his brother Misko Stary, the future Misko III, to join the Crusaders at Magdeburg, which St. Bernard had chosen as the meeting point for the crusade. The other significant force was a contingent of Czechs led by the bishop Henry Zdik of Olomouc, who would reach Magdeburg in July. So these were the main political leaders. They would also be joined by a small army of various Christian clerics representing the church and who provided the spiritual leadership for the crusade. Their mission was to organise the Christianisation of the country after the Wends had been defeated, the destruction of pagan holy places, and oversee the building of churches and division of the land into dioceses to extract tax, the dreaded 10% church tithe that was imposed on converts over and above the normal taxation by the state. Bishop Anselm of Havelberg, as we've mentioned previously, would be the Pope's official envoy on the crusade. Secondly, there was Adalbert, Archbishop of Hamburg, who would also accompany the Crusaders. And then there was Bishop Henry Zdik of Olomouc. This bishop had already gone on missions to try and convert the pagan Prussians in earlier years, so he had a strong interest in the area. He had originally volunteered to go on the crusade to the Middle East, but decided to join the Wendish Crusade as soon as plans became concrete. Bishop Thietmar of Verdun would also come along with a whole list of other clerics, including the bishops of Mainz, Halberstadt, Munster, Merseburg, Brandenburg and Olmütz. So, all in all, quite a formidable force of crusaders and a strong contingent of bishops of the church which would accompany the crusaders. There must have been high confidence that they could sweep aside any resistance that the Wends could put up. However, they were faced with a strong adversary across the River Elbe. This was Prince Nyklot, the leader of the Wendish people, and a chap that I mentioned in part 1 of this video. Prince Nyklot happened to be quite a brave, intelligent and resourceful chap. He was a member of the Obertreit tribe and would end up spending a considerable part of his life in the saddle, waging war against Christian forces during and after the crusade, and trying to maintain the independence of his people in as much as he could. Nicholas is reputed to have been born around the year 1090, so he would have been around 57 years of age during the Crusade. We know from the Annals of Magdeburg that he died in the year 1160, fighting the Christian forces of Henry the Lion. By that time he must have been around 70 years old. So, moving back to the Crusaders' camp, let's have a look at the plan that was decided on. Well, the idea that Henry the Lion and his fellow Crusaders agreed on was a multi-pronged attack against the Wends, with the Christian armies or contingents advancing from several directions and attacking 3 key cities and fortresses. The first force would be composed of the armies of Duke Henry the Lion of Saxony and Conrad of Zähringen, Duke of Burgundy, with the spiritual leadership of Archbishop Adalbert of Bremen, who would accompany the force personally, and Bishop Thietmar of Verdun tagging along for good measure. The target for this army would be the main Wendish fortress at Dobin, near the coast in the Bay of Wismar, one of their key defences and where Prince Nyklot and much of his force were situated. Meanwhile, the 2 Danish leaders, Canute and Sweyn, would carry out a seaborne attack, both sailing across the short stretch of the Baltic Sea and landing their Danish contingents on the north shore of Wendish territory. Their task was to destroy any Wendish garrisons in the area before marching south and joining forces with Henry the Lion and the Duke of Burgundy. Together, these separate forces, once combined, would form a powerful northern arm of a pincer attack. Meanwhile, the Danish fleet, which had transported the Danish armies, would patrol the sea and blockade the Wendish coastline. The southern arm of the pincer attack was also composed of 2 separate contingents and would attack further to the east. One force would be led by Albert the Bear and Conrad I and would head towards the Lutezian fort and city of Demmin, another key Wendish stronghold. Now, if both Demmin and Demmin fell, this would fatally undermine Wendish ability to defend their land. The second part of the southern force was led by the papal legate Anselm from Havelberg himself, as well as 6 other bishops from the cities of Mainz, Halberstadt, Munster, Merseburg, Brandenburg, Olmütz, tagging along to see the action. The party of bishops also included an abbot called Willibald of Crovery, who hoped to seize control of the island of Rügen and make it his own if things went the way of the Crusaders and the advance was continued northwards. This force was to carve their way through pagan territory and advance towards the Pomeranian border city of Stettin, which lay on the banks of the River Oder. This city was to be captured on the understanding that it was a pagan city with many important pagan temples, and this force was to have the help of the Polish contingent. Meanwhile, the main Polish army would also join a Russian force that attacked the pagan Prussians at the same time. The Pope had declared war against all pagans, not just the Wends, so attacking the Prussians was within the remit of the Crusaders. St. Bernard had called for all Crusaders from the west and south to assemble in Magdeburg by the 29th of June 1147, before the advance into pagan territory could begin. This would give the Crusaders the whole of the summer and autumn months to subjugate the Wends before the winter cold arrived. However, in the event, it wasn't until a month later in late July that all the various contingents involved in the crusade could make their way to the city and the advance could commence. Now, this delay in preparation, combined with the fact that news of a coming crusade was difficult to hide, meant that the Wends had time to prepare in as much as time allowed. It did leave Prince Nyklot, the Wendish leader, in a quandary as to how to deal with such an overwhelming force attacking from multiple directions. Now, Nyklot realised he simply didn't have the resources to take on all the Crusader forces. The best way would be to prevent the Danish contingents from joining up with the Saxon army in the north, and therefore intercepting them was the priority. With this in mind, he allied with his pagan neighbours, the Rugians, asking them for help in tackling the Danes as and when they attacked. Hopefully he could fend off the Danes before they could join up with Henry the Lion's forces. As far as fighting the Saxon army, Nyklot decided to do so on the defensive, on the ground that suited him, and which would nullify much of the numerical advantage that the Crusaders would have. So he chose to stay and make a stand at Dobin itself. Dobin was a strong fortress. It stood on the isthmus between two lakes, Lake Schwerin and a smaller lake called the Dope, thus making direct attacks pretty difficult to organise and for any attacking force to lay siege to the fortress. In addition, being around 8 miles from the sea meant only boats and ships with a shallow draft could approach the town. The fortress had good natural defences. The whole area was surrounded by marshland and forest, which would give the Saxons plenty of trouble to negotiate. These natural defences would blunt the advantages the Crusaders had in terms of numbers, and from the safety of his fortress, Nyklot hoped to wear out the Crusaders and force them to retreat. But firstly, Nyklot would take advantage of the Crusaders' slow preparations and take the initiative himself. He decided the best tactic was to surprise the enemy, which was the strongest, i.e. the Saxons. So on the 11th of June, he launched a sizable raid attacking new Saxon settlements in Wagria, which Christian settlers had established across the River Elbe. We have to assume, with Henry the Lion accumulating his force, this area was now far less well defended. Nyklot also assembled his navy to transport his army across the Baltic Sea. This navy would carry his men up to the mouth of the River Trave to the city of Lübeck. On the 26th of June, he attacked the city, which fell after 2 days of siege, and Helmold the chronicler writes that Nyklot took full revenge on all the Saxons and Danes and other people crossing into Wendish territory. Quote, that day were slain there 300 or more men, Eastern Holstein and especially those regions that had been settled by the Westphalians, Hollanders and other foreign people were consumed by the devouring flames, unquote, described Helmold of Bosau. Meanwhile, Nyklot would send his horsemen to ravage the vicinity of the city, and plenty of slaves were captured and taken back into Wendish territory. Now, this pre-emptive attack was a good idea militarily, but it also provided yet more excuse and ammunition for the church and various clerics, especially Bishop Anselm, to justify the crusade against what they claimed were belligerent pagans, and therefore may well have strengthened the Crusader forces in terms of volunteers. Who can say? Whatever the case, after ransacking Lübeck, Nyklot would then move back to Dobin and prepare for the Crusader advance. The Christian attack finally came in late summer when the Crusader forces had assembled and organised themselves. In the north, the 2 Danish fleets crossed the stretch of the Baltic Sea and began offloading their armies, while the 2 Saxon-led forces attacking Dobin, Demmin and Stettin advanced eastwards. But things didn't go entirely to plan after this for any of these contingents. The Danes managed to land on the Wendish coastline successfully, but it quickly became apparent that the pagan Rugians had decided to come to the aid of Nyklot and had sent their fleet to harry the Danes. Now, the Danes hadn't anticipated this move, it seems. According to Saxo Grammaticus, the Danes had made the mistake of not leaving sufficient men to guard the fleet, and therefore it was extremely vulnerable. The Rugians attacked the fleet and the guard, and managing to capture and kill many of the crew. Consequently, the Danes had to pull half of their army back to near the coast just to protect the fleet from further attack, and this meant only half of their contingent could march southwards towards Dublin to join up with the Saxons. Meanwhile, Nyklot, who had heard of the arrival of the Danes, led much of his force northwards to intercept the Danes before the Saxons and Danes could unite. Now, we don't know where exactly the two forces clashed, but we know the Wends defeated the Danes, forcing them back to the coast. Meanwhile, the Rugian ships attacked the Danish fleet at anchor, destroying a substantial portion. Now, these two setbacks seem to have spread panic within the Danish force, and the outcome was a hasty withdrawal. The Danes got back on their remaining ships, and the two Danish commanders quickly sailed back to their homeland, forgetting all about the crusade. Reaching Denmark, they then continued their quarrel over who had a right to the Danish crown, and that was pretty much the end of their contribution to the crusade. The Saxons and Danes would quarrel later about the Danish retreat, with the Saxons complaining the Danes hadn't put up a good show, and the Danes in turn complaining that the Saxons hadn't come to their help in turn. And there was even the suggestion that the Saxons had taken bribes from the pagans and had deliberately not helped the Danes in consequence. So, in this quarter at least, the Crusade created a fair amount of inter-Christian recrimination. Meanwhile, the Saxons under Henry the Lion and Adalbert had begun their advance and would eventually force their way to Dublin, where they laid siege to the fortress. But this force, it turned out, didn't have much luck either. They would find attacking the fortress very difficult. In addition, the Wendish light cavalrymen made constant attacks on the besiegers through the forest and marshland, not allowing them to rest at all. The siege of the fortress, in consequence, dragged on for many weeks. During this time, the Crusaders themselves began to have second thoughts about the attack. The fact was the Wends had already accepted Saxon supremacy and had been paying tribute before hostilities broke out. In addition, the siege was devastating the land all around, and that meant the tribute the Wends would and could have given in terms of produce was also disappearing before their eyes. Some of the troops began to increasingly question the attack on the Wends. Quote, "Is not the land we are devastating our land and the people we are fighting our people? Why are we then found to be our own enemies and the destroyers of our own incomes? Does not this loss fall back on our lords?" Unquote. So there was a certain level of confusion in the Crusader ranks as to what constituted success if the end result of the siege was the destruction of the land. In the end, as winter approached, Prince Nyklot offered the Crusaders a face-saving solution. He would agree to a nominal baptism if the Crusaders went back across the Elbe River. However, importantly, that was all that was agreed upon. No pagan temples were to be destroyed, no churches were to be built, and no Christian clergy or extra church tithes were to be imposed on the Wends. Now, the Crusaders, who were highly frustrated at this point and not looking forward at all to being in Wendish territory through a harsh winter, took the offer gladly. So, according to the sources of that time, a nominal number of Slav warriors, around 1,000, stepped forward and were baptised in the Dope Lake by an accompanying clergyman, Bishop Berno. And this, on paper at least, made this a Christian success and allowed the Crusaders to return home with their heads held up high and claiming victory. But Nyklot and his warriors had no intention of remaining Christian and immediately apostatized as soon as the Crusaders were out of sight. And as Almold describes, everything went back to as before, with the Wends continuing their pagan traditions. Finally, quote, "When our men were weary, an agreement was made to the effect that the Slavs were to embrace Christianity. Thus that grand expedition broke up with slight gain. The Slavs immediately afterwards became worse. They neither respected their baptism nor kept their hands from ravaging the Danes," unquote. So, just like the Danes, nothing was achieved by this Saxon army either. Now, that left the two southern arms of the attack, and these, as it would turn out, would also be staring at failure as well. The first force, headed by Albert the Bear and Conrad, had set out from Magdeburg towards Demmin, around 130 miles to the northeast. And they made initially good progress, managing to capture Havelberg, which had been made into a church city and a centre for missionary activity, but had been gained back by the pagans in the Great Slav Rebellion of 983. They next moved on to the city of Malchow near Lake Moritz, where they captured a castle and also destroyed an impressive pagan temple in the city. We know from the Annals of Magdeburg that the Christian forces destroyed a wide area, laying waste to many pagan towns while they stayed there for 3 months. The ambition, though, had been to reach Demmin, and this is the direction in which the force continued to advance. Once at Demmin, though, the Crusaders were repulsed, so things slowed down considerably. Some of the army would lay siege to the city but gave up in September, probably deciding there were richer pickings further east. Wybald, one of the clerics accompanying the force, would blame the reverse on the tensions amongst the Crusaders, and he returned home by early September himself. And it wasn't long before Anselm and the bishops heading the fourth column, in their infinite wisdom, managed to convince the two Margraves to join them in the advance towards Pomerania and to capture the city of Stettin. So the attack on Demmin pretty much fizzled into nothing, and the attention moved to the city of Stettin by the River Oder instead. Now, as this combined force approached Stettin, they readied themselves to lay siege to it. However, to their surprise, they found that the city was now Christian, or rather nominally Christian, since the Pomeranian prince Ratibor had accepted Christianity and, under pressure from the Poles, had already asked his people to convert as well. And this was confirmed when the townspeople erected crosses on the city walls and sent their resident bishop Adalbert, Bishop of Pomerania, out to remonstrate against the Crusaders. The bishop asked them why they were attacking a Christian city rather than making war on pagans. Well, the answer must have been that the Crusaders were under the impression that the city was still pagan. Either that, or they had planned to sack the city regardless of religion, much like Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders 50 years later. And this was what Vincent of Prague, writing later, would argue, stating that the Saxon nobles in reality had ambitions to conquer the city and that the conversion of the locals was a lesser priority. But the Crusaders could hardly sack a Christian city, with Bishop Anselm, the spiritual leader of the force, preventing any move on the city. And therefore peace was confirmed with Prince Ratibor. Another face-saving solution was hammered out. Bishop Henry's Dick negotiated an agreement whereby Prince Ratibor, formerly a pagan, would publicly confirm he was a Christian and would remain a Christian, which he agreed to save his city from being destroyed. In addition, he was required to travel to Havelberg and promise in front of the Saxon nobles and clergy that he would protect and advance the Christian religion in Pomerania. The Annals of Magdeburg record that Ratibor, quote, confessed the same Catholic faith that he had recently received through the preaching of Bishop Otto of Bamberg, and he recognised, praised and swore that he would always labour with all his might to defend and propagate the Christian faith, unquote. So the Pomeranians now not only fell under the religious sway of the Saxon Catholics, but also submitted to the temporal power of the Germans. And in return, the Crusaders dispersed, returning home with nothing achieved apart from the submission by the Pomeranian prince. The only action that took place after this was by the Polish monarch, Duke Boleslav IV, who wanted to gain something after all the effort that had been expended. According to the Annals of Magdeburg, the Duke decided to continue the crusade, and a few months later he organised a major attack on the Prussians instead. Some historians count this as part of the Wendish Crusade, as the momentum, motivation and time frame were the same. In the Prussian territory that was annexed, the Duke declared a new law, according to Vincent Cadlebec, writing around 1200 CE, which declared that, quote, those who would choose the Christian manner of worship would not be harmed either in person nor would their property suffer, but those who would not renounce the sacrilegious heathen rites would without delay be punished with death, unquote. And you could think of this action as a precursor to the Prussian Crusade, which would come during the 13th century and which I'll be covering in future as well. So, in conclusion, on paper, the Crusade didn't achieve anywhere near as much as the Crusader armies had hoped for, given their overwhelming strength. The primary objectives had been to defeat the pagans, convert them by force if necessary, and establish churches in the area. But the Crusaders had failed to defeat the Wendish warriors decisively. Neither did they manage to force Christianity immediately on these people. Nyklot and some of his men had only gone through a nominal conversion. They had no interest in real conversion and therefore quickly went back to their own beliefs as soon as the Crusaders disappeared. The Crusaders themselves had managed to destroy a total of only one pagan temple, when they had been expected to have razed many more to the ground. So, as expected, there was severe criticism of the Crusaders from various sources, especially the church authorities. St. Bernard also received much criticism for urging on a crusade which hadn't been managed properly, and his standing and reputation suffered. He died in 1153, just 6 years after the crusade. However, going beyond the immediate consequences, the two sieges of Dobin and Demmin had quite a devastating long-term economic effect. What these lengthy sieges had done was to reduce much of the Wendish people to starvation, as the Crusaders had camped round the cities and countryside, looting and plundering. Famine in the Wendish countryside was widespread during the war, so the outcome of the crusade was to fatally weaken the Wends sufficiently for them to come under Christian dominance permanently in the coming decades. Although the Wends had put up a good resistance, they simply didn't have the numbers to win a long war of attrition against numerically superior enemies who had access to far more resources and, importantly, were filled with extreme religious fervour. The main winners in this race for Wendish territory were Henry the Lion and Albert the Bear. 5 years after the Crusade, in 1152, Frederick Barbarossa became the new German king. 3 years later, Barbarossa would become the Holy Roman Emperor, succeeding Conrad. Like Conrad, the new emperor had his eyes on more territory in Italy, but he allowed Henry the Lion and Albert the Bear to continue the Saxon advance eastwards. The Wends would now be squeezed by the Saxon Margraves and the Danes. In fact, a sort of rivalry developed between the various Saxon lords and the new and ambitious Danish king Waldemar as to who could gain the most territory in the east, and an agreement was hammered out to prevent conflict between the Christian powers. Similar to the Wendish Crusade, the plan was for the Danes to ravage and capture the Wendish coast and territory to the north, while the Saxons advanced further to the south. While this was happening, missionaries in the church also took advantage of the weakened state of the Wends. The Danes under Eskil, the Archbishop of Lund, made constant attacks on the Wendish coastal towns and cities, only allowing those who accepted baptism to stay alive. And this meant during the 1160s onwards, most of the coastline would drop into the hands of the Danes, culminating in the conquest of Arkona, which we'll go into in the third part of this series. It was in one of these ongoing Christian advances and conflicts that Prince Nyklot was killed in the year 1160. As a combined Saxon-Danish force advanced eastwards, Nyklot had decided to sacrifice the Wendish fortresses of Dobin, Schwerin, Mecklenburg and Lau, preferring to retreat further east and make a stand at another fortress, the castle stronghold of Bergwall. He therefore set these fortresses on fire to prevent them from falling into Saxon or Danish hands. During the retreat eastwards, though, Nyklot was killed in a skirmish against the Christians, and this was a big loss to the Wends and effectively signalled a decline in organised Wendish resistance, although hostilities would go on for a while. Nyklot had two sons, Pribislav and Wertislav, who would continue the fighting after Nyklot's death, although the Wendish army would be pushed back across the Warnow River. The brothers managed to instigate a final revolt against Saxon hegemony in 1163. Pribislav would make a stand at his fortress at Werl on the River Warnow, close to the city of Rostock, which the Saxons refused to lay siege to, perhaps because of its good defensive position. Wertislav would later manage the defence of Werl, while Pribislav meanwhile took the offensive elsewhere and managed to take back many of the Wendish cities and fortresses taken by the Saxons, including Mecklenburg, Malchow, Quetzin, before the Saxons turned the tables and managed to defeat the Wends. The Saxons would eventually capture the Wendish fortress at Werl, and Wertislav, who was captured, would be publicly hanged at Malchow. On the 6th of July 1164, the decisive Battle of Wirchen near the town of the same name took place. Pribislav, with the help of troops led by the still pagan Pomeranian dukes Bogislav and Casimir, advanced towards the army of Duke Henry the Lion of Saxony, at that time situated near Demmin. Now, the Christian army was pretty strong, consisting of troops from Saxony, Holstein, Dithmarschen and Frisia, as well as receiving men from the Danish fleet of King Waldemar raiding the coast. And for perhaps the last time, the Saxons and Danes would combine and conclusively beat Pribislav and his Wendish army in a tough battle. The Wends are said to have lost 2,500 men, while on the Christian side, the Saxon Count of Holstein, Adolf II, died along with 450 Saxon casualties. And this battle effectively ended mainstream Wendish resistance, and Pribislav himself had to flee to Pomerania. He would have continued to put up resistance with the forces he managed to accumulate and would continue raiding Saxon-held territory. Meanwhile, the Christian army ransacked and pillaged the already worn-out Wendish people in retribution. In 1167, Henry the Lion, now at loggerheads with the Danes, offered to make Pribislav the new Prince of Mecklenburg in return for his support. But the offer came with strings attached that he must convert to Christianity and that he must support Henry as his vassal. And this Pribislav would finally agree to and was baptised around this time. Previslav also married one of Henry's daughters to cement the relationship, so the last Wendish pagan leader quickly evolved into the first Christian Prince of Mecklenburg, and his son Henry Bowen would become the first Duke of Mecklenburg, a title his descendants would keep for another 700 years, in fact right till the end of the First World War. The very last piece of pagan Wendish resistance we know of came in 1185 when a Wendish leader called Bogislav made an attack against the Danes with what forces he could accumulate, but lost the battle. And the day after the battle he offered his surrender and began negotiations with the Archbishop Absalon of Denmark, and history records that he was carried back to his tent weeping and drunk after the negotiations were finished, as he perhaps realised all hope was lost. And that definitively marked the end of pagan resistance. Now, this was nearly 40 years after the Wendish Crusade proper and showed the tenacity with which the Wends tried to maintain their independence and beliefs. But with defeat, the old Wends and their culture and religion would now quickly disappear, and a new Christianised and Germanised Wendish population would now develop. Perhaps the biggest issue the Wendish people now faced after being converted was the danger of complete assimilation. And that was because of the quickening pace of migration of Germans into these conquered Wendish lands. German peasants now took over plots of land beginning what was called the Ostsiedlung proper of the German eastward expansion. And what this meant was that the Wendish lands gradually became almost entirely Germanic in stock, culture and traditions, with little of the Slavic traditions remaining due to intermarriage and the dissolving of Wendish culture. And the Wends too took up German culture and language, almost wholly disappearing as a completely separate community. Helmold of Bozar explains that Albert the Bear helped greatly in the dilution of the Wendish population. Quote, he brought over large numbers of Hollanders, Zealanders and Flemings and had them live in the strongholds and villages of the Slavs. As churches multiplied and the income from the tithes grew to enormous sums, the Diocese of Brandenburg as well as of Havelberg benefited greatly by the influx of colonists. Now, this Germanic expansion and cultural imperialism would carry on extending all across northeastern Europe. Holstein, Mecklenburg, Brandenburg and Pomerania became essentially German, and later Silesia, Bohemia, Poland and Prussia would also become German in orientation, and this expansion would continue into the Baltic republics of present-day Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, leaving its mark right up to the First World War when these regions finally lost their German control and influence. Perhaps a quote from the famous German historian of the late 19th and early 20th century, Karl Lamprecht, who would describe this German expansion across the Baltic region as, quote, the one great accomplishment of a German people during the Middle Ages, unquote, would be quite appropriate at this point. And that perhaps indicates at least to some measure the dramatic impact that this movement of German people eastwards had had in northeastern Europe. But going quickly back to the late 12th century, in the year 1171, the Pope at the time, Alexander III, issued a new papal bull entitled Non Parum Animus Noster, which called for further crusades in the Baltic region aimed at the other Baltic pagan communities. Quote, we are deeply distressed and greatly worried when we hear that the savage Estonians and other pagans in those parts rise and fight God's faithful and those who labour for the Christian faith and fight the virtue of the Christian name. And he asked Christians to, quote, gird themselves armed with celestial weapons and the strength of apostolic exhortations to defend the truth of the Christian faith bravely and to expand the Christian faith forcefully, unquote. And many Wends who would by the start of the 13th century be thoroughly Christianized would join in these future crusades, taking up service with the Teutonic Knights, the monastic order which was expanding in the eastern Baltic. And so the cycle of pagans being forcibly converted and themselves forcing others in due course continued. So, summing up, as you can see, the Wendish Crusade wasn't a qualified and immediate success, nor as it turned out was the main crusade against the Muslims in the Middle East. The forces of both the French King Louis VII and the German King Conrad III were defeated in Asia Minor and later failed to take Damascus as well. As Otto of Freising, one of those scholars who accompanied the crusade, wrote, but, quote, since the outcome of that expedition, because of our sins, is known to all, we who have purposed this time to write not a tragedy but a joyous history, leave this to be related by others elsewhere. Unlike the Middle Eastern Crusade, the Wendish Crusade did have a second part. The very last pagan stronghold remaining in the west was the island of Rugia on the Wendish coast. And this was where the famous temple to the Slavic god Swantowit in the city of Okona was situated. and this temple was famous all across the northern Baltic. This island of Rugia was attacked by the Danes, and the people forcibly converted a few decades later, ending the pagan presence in what is present-day Germany permanently. And that attack on Rugia is a very interesting subject, which I'll cover in the next video in this series. Anyway, apologies for the fairly longish video, but I hope the topic of the subjection of the Wends was covered in sufficient detail. And if you managed to stay the course, I really appreciate you watching, and please do look out for the next episode. Thanks again, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you like what you saw.